Great. So today I just wanted to introduce Daniel Larremore. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and in the BioFrontiers Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's an affiliate at the Department of Applied Math as well, and an external faculty member at the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His work focuses on models of generative networks and understanding epidemiology, as well as social science. As I was talking to him a few minutes ago, he was an Omidyar Fellow, a very prestigious position at the Santa Fe Institute from 2015 to 2017. And before that, he got a PhD in applied math at CU Boulder. And then he was an undergrad at Washington University in St. Louis. And with that, I would like you to take it away, Daniel. I look forward to this talk.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. It's really nice to present this work because, like many others who have been doing research on infectious disease dynamics, everything has been COVID for the past year. And so it's so nice to not talk about that. In fact, after now, I won't even mention it. So again, thanks for having me. If at any point you have some ideas or want to get in touch, my contact information is here on the right. And what I'll talk about today are kind of 4 projects that are underway. One of them is in press, but the others are under peer review and being written up for submission. So it's all fresh stuff, and I'd love to maybe take that as an opportunity to get some feedback and see what you think. Of course, anytime that I say I or we, what I really mean are these folks listed here. Hunter Wapman, Ali Morgan, Un Lee, Mari, Nicole, and Phil. These are all the folks that have been kind of in the driver's seat for the research that I'll be talking about today. And they've been advised or assisted by Mirta, Aaron, and Sam. So the premise of a lot of our work in the lab is that science is an ecosystem and researchers are its species. And we gain a lot from thinking about things in this sort of ecological framework because we think that it structures problems really nicely. Like, for example, we know that in academia and in science, we have a competition for resources, as well as adaptation when resources change. So think about grant writing, think about the sort of creeping age of Nobel laureates, which seem to get older and older each year. Things like AI winters suggesting some sort of seasonality or exogenous effects of the environment. We also have replication with mutation and recombination, the mathematical genealogy project, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Chaperone effects, where people sort of help each other understand how to write for particular audiences. Interdisciplinarity is really almost a process of recombination formally. Niche formation and colonization. I mean, this is really about fellowship and job applications, first mover advantages into creating new fields. Red Queen effects, where you have the annual scramble over US news rankings, where everybody's trying to optimize the same metrics and nobody goes anywhere at all. And then roles and life cycles with growth and collapse. We have theorists and experimentalists in different roles, scientists and funders in different roles. And then sort of growth of fields like machine learning and collapse and rebuilding like social psychology with some of its recent trials with replicability. Just as a hypothesis, I think replicability is coming for a lot of machine learning research as well, but that's something that I'd love to chat with folks about maybe in one-on-one meetings. In any case, we really think that science as an ecosystem. Great. Okay, so we'll just pick up here. We've learned that an ecosystem is a nice model for science, and we've learned a little bit about invasive species in this current moment. Okay. Anyway, okay. So Zoom aside, our premise here when we're thinking about the ecosystem and researchers is really that we want to understand individuals and the factors that shape their careers, and we want to get some sense of the broader ecosystem. So we'll talk about 3 things today. One is ecosystem structure. And I'll talk a lot about the sort of dominance structures and stability of prestige in the faculty hiring labor market. Second is more about ecosystem dynamics, which will just be some mathematical models of faculty hiring networks. And third, to really focus on the fact that in our modeling, we're treating all individuals just sort of like a physicist would as maybe particles in a system, but these are really people. And so we'll talk about unequal impacts of parenthood that shape academic careers and discuss a little bit about how that might affect future modeling efforts. So to give you a brief introduction to this idea of faculty hiring networks, what you're seeing over here on the left is a figure from a 2015 paper led by Aaron Clauset, where we got resumes from all of the sitting computer science faculty in the US and Canada. And from that, we were able to identify where people got their PhDs and where they're now faculty. And from that, we could create a directed graph where a flow from I to J just counts the number of faculty who are now at J, who got a PhD at I. So for instance, we're highlighting all of the people here who got PhDs at MIT, who are now faculty elsewhere in this set of 9 other institutions. What's interesting about looking at these faculty hiring networks is that we can think about them as an expression of some preferences. So our premises in thinking about these are that really each hiring committee wants to hire the best among those applicants. I think in no faculty search would you get 200 applications or whatever and then say, we want to hire the 50th best person for the job. Really, it's a filtering process to try to find the person who is at the top of the stack. So with that in mind, that each hire reflects some kind of individual level preferences, when we look at the entire network, we can look at collective preferences. And as a consequence, we can try and understand whether or not there is an ordering or alignment that most comports with everyone's preferences. So that could let us do something like here, creating a ranking where we're trying to find some ordering such that those institutions at the top are tending to place their faculty at other prestigious institutions so that we get as many of the flow sort of moving down the network as possible and as few flowing up the network. So we can turn the ordering of the nodes in a network into more of a math or algorithmic problem where we try and find that ordering. And there are various solutions to this, but it turns out that they all generally put the nodes in around the same order. But what happens when you do this is that it really reveals that there is a clear ordering and structure to faculty hiring networks. So instead of a linear hierarchy where I'm placing a node at the top and moving downward, we're going to put the top node at 12:01 on the clock and wrap all the way around to 11:59. When we do that, the diagram of faculty hiring network, and at least in computer science shown here, looks something like this. So what I've done here is made the width of the bars according to the number of people who got their PhD at this institution who are now faculty elsewhere. And I've colored the edges blue if that flow is 100% down the hierarchy, gray if it's balanced, so one person going up along that link and one person going down, for instance, or red if the movement is up the hierarchy. And if you look at this diagram and it looks like a giant blue hairball, you're not missing something. It really is systematic. So we find that 90% of the hiring movement in computer science, at least, is down the hierarchy. But it's also really steep. So you'll notice that Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, Caltech, Harvard, Cornell, these are all much wider than institutions on the other side of midnight here that are much skinnier, maybe supplying 1 or 2 faculty to the rest of the network. In fact, fewer than 7% of faculty have PhD from the lower 3/4 of universities. And so not only is it systematic, but it's also very steep. But beyond that, we find that it's, in computer science anyway, biased, with the median change for women being around 3 ranks worse than for men. So what I mean by that is that the typical person moves downward in this hierarchy, but women tend to move farther down than men do in computer science.
Then before you go on, could you point out where USC is?
Yes, let's find out. I should have done my homework and been prepared for this. So let's.
Oh, it's way down the line.
25, 22 should be like, no?
Anybody have a number?
It's above UC Irvine. Oh, there's Maryland. Maryland's 27.
Between Hopkins and Rochester.
Which
Oh, there we
numbers?
are.
Oh, Southern California.
23. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's consistent with US News and World Report. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and in fact, when we take various ranking methods, both for analyzing the network and then compare them with some of these sort of feature-based ranking methods like US News or New York Times or whatever, Times Higher Ed, We find that they're all very highly correlated, which is perhaps not surprising. But one thing that I think is interesting about faculty hiring is that what we're really viewing here is a network representation of how departments view each other. And unlike US News, which sort of cooks up its rankings from things like donation rates, student test scores, and so on, this is a lot more really how faculty are evaluating each other's applicants. So that's computer science. But if we look at other fields like history and business, colored and organized in the same way, you can see the same general patterns. So we again have inequality in faculty production, where the top institutions are really supplying a lot more of the faculty. And we see that in general, people tend to move down. These graphs are all basically blue. If you're a network scientist and you're asking yourself whether or not the heterogeneity in the degrees, so in the actual number of PhDs placed here, could just be responsible for that ordering, that sort of 90% down movement, the answer is actually that if you use a directed version of the configuration model to rewire the network and sort of randomize it, but fix the number of faculty that are supplied by each of these departments, you actually get hierarchies that are less steep than the ones that we empirically observe. So even when tested against sort of a statistical null model, we see more hierarchy than we expect. If you're interested in exploring, this is sort of available as a hover over and explore your own version on my website. So that was in 2015, and we've recently been analyzing data from across academia to try and understand how universal these patterns actually are. So what I'll show you in the following slides, we're looking at around 200,000 faculty over 365 institutions with hiring data spanning 8 years of hiring. So the first thing that we needed to do in this project was really to create some kind of taxonomy to understand, well, what are fields, what are the areas they aggregate into, and what are the umbrellas that those areas aggregate into. And so to give you an example, physics, astronomy, and atmospheric sciences or meteorology are 3 of our 81 fields. And these are all grouped together under physical sciences, one of our 25 areas, and physical sciences, along with chemical, earth, and biological sciences, are all filed together under natural sciences. So we have this kind of a taxonomy. Of course, you could define it in a bunch of different ways. And one of the ways that we did this was to ask whether or not fields were sort of closed in hiring. In other words, if I look at the departments in, let's say, a proposed field, let's call it computer science, say these are departments of computer science, I can then ask how many of the currently sitting faculty got PhDs from outside of those departments. And if a field is not sufficiently closed, then we decide not to consider it a field and ask whether or not we could merge it with another field to sort of find a more natural grouping of departments. So 81 fields, 25 areas, and 8 umbrellas. The way that they look when we look at some basic statistics are as follows. So in the colors, you can see the different umbrella terms, the areas in the next column, and then the individual fields. And I don't really mean to overwhelm you with just a ton of text on here, but I do want to highlight that these are really varying in size. So I've made in dashed lines, you can see where you have 6,000 faculty in a particular field. And in terms of institutional representation, you can see fields where you have 200 or so departments in the other dashed line. So a lot of heterogeneity here. For instance, in agriculture, we tend to have smaller fields, both measured in terms of number of people and in terms of number of institutions. Whereas if we look at something like computer science is one of the larger fields with over 6,000 faculty and around 200 departments. So another way of looking at this, rather than sort of the full taxonomy in bar charts, is just to sort of throw away all of the labeling and just look at changes by size. So field on the left, area in the middle, then umbrella and academia with the color coding shown over here on the right. Academia sort of aggregates everything together. And so this is the superset of everything to the left. So you can see the 365 fields, or sorry, institutions represented over here. Naturally, this sort of taxonomic size increases as we aggregate the teal into fewer teal and into just one teal as we move up from field to area to umbrella. But you can see that there's a wide variety in representation of topics across institutions. For example, let's take medicine and health in yellow as an example. You'll find medicine and health departments in, say, around 100 different institutions. And if we contrast that with purple, which is engineering, you can see that there are engineering fields that are much more widely spread across institutions. In fact, kind of a nice way of thinking about this is that at the area level, around half or actually over half of institutions have some kind of engineering program or department. So we definitely see some amount of clustering as well as a lot of heterogeneity. But of course, we're not just interested in size. We know that different fields vary in their representations, in gender balance, in the kinds of topics they study, and the kinds of people they attract. And so when we look at the gender balance within these different fields, what I'm plotting here now on the vertical axis is not the size of those fields, but the fraction of faculty in those fields who we think are women. So in spite of the variability within taxa, you can see clear clustering. So for instance, within applied sciences, we see a relatively narrow range of gender balance, which is in high contrast to education. Medicine and health, we get a much wider variety. In case you're wondering, I always wonder about the outliers. This field up here is nursing. And then in engineering, we see far lower gender ratios. So engineering and the natural sciences with computer science and physics and some of the engineering fields are typically those that are discussed as having lower representation of women. But I think that in a broader context, you can see that within areas, we also see very similar patterns. And there's a lot of heterogeneity here, but also a lot of kind of clustering. So we were interested in seeing these patterns. And I think that anybody who studies these systems, but also lives in them, has to wonder is how these ideas of both heterogeneity and clustering sort of shape our thinking about mechanisms. So at least to me, one of the natural follow-on questions is, what are the processes that shape the differences in between fields, in between areas, or even in between umbrellas? You can also look at faculty production. This is something that came through very clearly in those sort of circular plots. But what I'm showing here is institutions lined up from 0 out to 365. And the percentage of faculty in the overall system of academia that those institutions have produced. So here, producing over 3.5% of all sitting faculty in our data set is UC Berkeley. Next to this is Harvard. University of Colorado is somewhere around 44th in terms of production. But we see a clear drop-off and heterogeneity here that suggests that the vast majority of faculty are coming from just a handful of institutions. And if we disaggregate into those umbrella terms, you can see that we get very similar patterns for applied sciences, education, engineering, formal sciences, and so on. Of course, this is kind of nice to stare at, and at least to me, I want to hover over these and see which institution is which. But a nice way of compressing this information in each one of these kinds of plots is to look at something called the Lorenz curve. So a Lorenz curve asks what percentage of institutions produce what percentage of faculty. So here you can see the fraction of institutions that we add to our consideration going from 0 up to 1. And as we keep adding institutions, which are for this purpose ranked in order of how many faculty they produce, we produce a growing fraction of the faculty. So at the field, area, umbrella, and academia level, you can see that we're nowhere near what would be the sort of equal production line at the diagonal. One thing that I think helps is to identify this point here, where you have 20% of institutions and 80% of faculty. And this is something that some people call the Pareto principle. This 80-20 mark is where 80% of faculty come from just 20% of institutions. Now, interestingly, if you look at where the lines actually line up with this 80-20 point, you see that at the whole academia level, it's basically spot on. But as we move down to the umbrella level, the area level, and the field level, we get less of this effect. So the inequalities really vary here with scale. That 80% drops to, I say only 60 to 70% or 75% at the field level, which I think suggests something interesting. There's sort of academia-wide visibility, but once you're in a particular field, the fraction of graduates who come from particular institutions becomes a little bit more balanced. And this leads to something where you may have field level notoriety for your institution, but maybe more general obscurity. So this sometimes comes across in conferences. If you say where you're from and somebody says, sorry, like where is that exactly? Just anecdotally, what has happened to me over the years is, when I was at Santa Fe Institute, there's some conferences that you would go to where people have heard of Santa Fe Institute and they understand what it is. And then other fields where I'd go to a conference and people would have no idea what it was at all, and wonder if, is that like a think tank, or is that a government lab, or what? So even within sort of the inequalities in production, we can see that there are differences when you look down at the field level. These are still kind of difficult ways to compare. Like if I want to look at one field versus another, comparing Lorenz curves is difficult. So we can actually compress this information again to a single point into what's called the Gini coefficient. And Gini coefficients measure inequality in consumption or production, or anything where you have a Lorenz curve and you want to express it as a single point. So these are Gini coefficients again for our different areas of aggregation. And one thing that I'll point out is that these are all higher than something that we typically think of as very unequal, which is US income inequality pre-tax. So the Gini coefficient for that is about 0.49. And here you can see that our plots start at 0.5. So at all of these different levels of aggregation and across fields, we see very high production inequality. One interesting thing that you'll note is that the Gini coefficients actually increase with aggregation. So when I go from all of the individual fields within applied science as individual networks, and I combine those networks into 3 areas, or again into one umbrella, the Gini coefficients generally go up. And one reason for this is that the institutions that produce lots of faculty in one field often do so in other fields. So essentially you have heavy-tailed distributions that share heavy tails. And so when you stack them together, those tails sort of compound each other and you get magnified inequality, at least viewed from this Gini coefficient. That also suggests something interesting, which we haven't yet explored, but I think could be very cool, which is that if we get increasing Gini coefficients as we move from field to area to umbrella, it suggests that we should have decreasing Gini coefficients as we move from field into subfield. So I don't think anybody to date has really looked at subfield level hiring networks, let's say within machine learning or within NLP. But it suggests that you should see less inequality as you disaggregate and go down to finer grain as well. So one of the things that's very interesting about this, instead of just looking at kind of basic statistics like the out degrees in our networks, which are the number of faculty that are placed by particular departments, we can look at prestige. So again, we've been thinking about this recursive notion of prestige, which sort of reads as an institution is prestigious if its graduates are hired by other prestigious institutions. Put differently, prestige really measures these collective preferences or choices for hiring decisions. And so those collective choices are really embodied in this faculty hiring network, where AIJ is the number of people with a PhD from I who are now faculty at J. So the procedure that we're going to go through now is for each field, area, or umbrella, form this adjacency matrix A and then rank the nodes. There are various ways of doing that. The way that I'll talk about today is based on a really fast method called spring rank that I developed with Kate DeBacco and Chris Moore. But when we do this for the computer science faculty hiring network, what we get is not an ordinal ranking, but an embedding of the nodes along the real line. So we have the top ranked institution here, moving downward, where each node is placed or embedded high to low, depending on the patterns of hiring. I've colored this such that all of the flow down the network is on the right and in blue, and all the flow up the network, sort of against the grain or against the current, is up on the left and in red. So the fraction of downward edges in blue really provides a measure of alignment to hierarchy. So we can see that indeed there's more of a flow down on the right than left moving up. But again, we can look at different fields and their alignment with their own hierarchies. And what we see is hierarchy at all levels. So the fraction of downward edges here is plotted on the vertical axis. And again, you can see these distributions ranging from, sort of at the minimum around 68% alignment with the hierarchy, up to over 95% alignment with the hierarchy. And we see this at field, area, umbrella, and for academia, around 79% of hires are aligned with the overall hierarchy. Now, again, these are just sort of summary numbers of those network properties, but these hierarchies are all significantly steeper than those that you would find under a degree-preserving randomization of the network. So these are not just driven by those inequalities in production that we looked at before, and these are actually significantly steeper than that. We can also ask, how far down the hierarchy do people typically travel when they get jobs? We know that the average person goes from a higher prestige PhD to a lower prestige faculty job in this ecosystem. So we can just chart on a 0 to 1 scale how far down people move. So at this line here, people are on average moving 10% down the hierarchy, and in the line up here, annotated 40% down the hierarchy. So this green dot is a field in humanities. Anybody want to guess what field that might be? 40% down the hierarchy, typical?
No idea. What would it be?
So it's classics. The typical professor in classics gets a PhD and then moves nearly halfway down this prestige hierarchy in the job market. So we can think of classics as an especially steep field where really a few institutions dominate most of the job placements. In general, though, most people move somewhere around 20% to 30% down the hierarchy. One interesting thing that came out of this analysis of the larger system was that in computer science, we saw that there was a difference between how the system treats men and women. But when we look at individual fields, areas, umbrellas, or academia, what we see is that in general, actually, women move slightly less far down the hierarchy, 16% down versus men 17% down. But this difference between them is not statistically significant. One other thing that we can do is just look at rankings across fields now as revealed by those patterns in faculty hiring. So the procedure here is that for each field, we extract and assemble that faculty hiring network, compute a ranking of the departments from the patterns in the network, and then we just analyze pairwise correlations between how those individual fields rank each other's departments. So this heat map is showing in blue colors positive correlations and in red colors negative correlations. And just a few notes here. So when I look at this, I see no particularly clear clustering by field type. Maybe we could convince ourselves that the engineering block here is slightly more correlated. But in general, there's no like clear clustering that just jumps out, or at least is aligned with our divisions into social sciences, natural sciences, and the other umbrella terms. The vast majority of these correlations are over 80%. Which suggests that in terms of mechanism, we can start to think about what drives similar patterns that are highly correlated across different layers of the faculty hiring network. And if you're interested in, I always am interested in the outliers here. So this band here is theology within humanities. that tends to be different than others. This one here is pharmacy within medicine and health. And then in natural sciences, we have pathology. So that was sort of a guide through the atlas of faculty hiring networks. Just in summary, we see an 80 to 90% alignment with a linear hierarchy. We see a strong preference for elite training, where 80% of faculty come from around 20% of institutions. And these hierarchies, both production and prestige, are correlated across US academia. So in terms of the ecosystem, prestige is really something that seems to structure a lot of the ecosystem around us, such that, you know, when you look at the faculty in a particular department and you ask where they got their PhDs from, you can make a pretty strong guess as to the kinds of institutions that most people in academia, as well as their colleagues, are coming from. So next I want to talk to you about some mathematical models of faculty hiring networks, but maybe it'd be nice to pause here if anybody has questions.
As I recall, you found that women are on average at a institution that's ranked about 3 placements below men. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, so that was looking at 2011 data from computer science only.
Okay.
Then when we expanded it to look at across academia, we saw that pattern that we see in CS isn't sustained across all fields.
Okay, so thank you.
Yeah.
So I had a question about, I've been wondering about the impact of the size of the different institutions, like how many students they train and how many faculty they have.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, if you have 2 institutions, one prestigious and very large and one non-prestigious and very small, then naturally, you know, the good students will have to go, a lot of them, to the smaller institution, because, you know, there's a limit to how many more faculty even the big one can hire, or something like that. So I was just wondering about the impact of the relative sizes of the different institutions on the results.
Yeah, so we see a few interesting things. Actually, I wonder if I have this as a bonus slide. Did I put it in? Did I skip it? Oh, shoot. Take one more look for it. Ah, yeah, okay. Let me show you this. So what we're looking at here is this question of, do institutions produce as many as they employ? So the percentage of total faculty in the system that are employed at an institution, percentage of faculty who got their PhD at that institution. What you can see on the left here in the scatter is that most places at various sizes are sort of underproducing relative to the line. But then, as your intuition suggests, at larger institutions that are employing more, so bigger departments, you also see, or bigger institutions, you also see that they tend to place more faculty than they currently host. Of course, there are all of these outliers that also show up above the line that are interesting. We can express that differently, just as a ratio. So on a log scale over here on the right, you can see the 1-to-1 line for production to employment. So Caltech is way over here on the right, producing far more than they have on their roster, as well as other institutions that place far fewer. So the mean here is a ratio of 0.65.
Out of curiosity, where is CU Boulder, and where do you think USC is, if you were to guess?
So I actually don't know, but I would like to, well, one of the things that Hunter is really good at in his analyses are making kind of interactive visualization. So when we put this online, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have kind of fully navigable versions of some of these plots.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, let me stop this. Okay, so one thing that I think is really interesting when we think about sort of the uniformity across fields and these shared patterns is that faculty hiring networks are always changing, right? People retire, hire, and move. They're varying somewhat in their steepness, but they're highly correlated across fields, and they tend to be stable over time. So to me, this sounds like a dynamical system in which all of the different subsystems are kind of caught in the same general orbit. So to me, this sounds something like an attractor. So we've been trying to think about the dynamics of these systems in a couple different models. So the first one is really all about rankings and memory. It's a process of updating and forgetting. And so the equation that drives this analysis is that I have next year's faculty hiring network, T plus 1, is given by last year's network, updated with some new hires, and mixed with this sort of forgetting parameter and new hiring parameter. So it's a very abstracted version of faculty hiring where we're sort of decreasing the salience of past hires by the scalar factor lambda, and then adding in new hires via some updates. So the way that this works in practice is that one time step, I have some faculty hiring network. I create a new link, delta, that's annotated at the dashed line here. And that gets created. So in the next time step, that is a fresh link in this dark black color. But you can see that we've slightly forgotten some of those older links that existed. And I then propose a new link here in delta. That link will get created in the next time step. And then the others sort of fade a little bit into lighter and lighter shades of gray, and we propose a new link and so on. So the hiring process continues, but retirement here is not explicit at the link level. We just sort of forget the signals of prestige in the past. But at each stage here, we're going to re-rank the nodes so that when I form this new hire from the pink node up to the blue node, it actually changes the ranks of blue and pink. So this term delta of T generates new hires based on the desirability of graduates. And the way that we model this is through a random utility model, which is common in the marketing literature, where people are making discrete choices from among a set of alternatives. When we think about faculty hiring, our view of it is that you can think about it as this discrete choice. I have a set of candidates whom I could hire, and I want to know which one I should hire. One of the typical assumptions in this model is that there's some amount of randomness. They typically choose randomness or noise from a Gumbel distribution. And one interesting about that is that under those assumptions, the probability that you would choose candidate I as a hiring institution J, given some rankings S, is equal to just e to the utility that you'd get from that hire over the sum of all the alternative utilities. So S here is a vector of nodes ranks based on, in this study, page rank, spring rank, or just the out degree centrality. And Uij, again, is J's utility from choosing I. So the utility here is going to depend on the ranks. And we chose a very simple form, which is a coefficient times the rank of J, and a coefficient times the difference in ranks between the two institutions squared. So beta 1 really controls a preference for prestige. How much do you like the prestige of this person coming from J? And beta 2 controls the preferences for similar pedigree. So if the difference between prestiges is too large, then beta 2 might become negative. So it's a relatively simple model. And we chose page rank, spring rank, and out degree centrality because all of these have very clean and clear linear algebra representations. So what's nice about that is that we now have this sort of generative model, but our choices of ranking functions allow us to write down really tractable likelihood functions. Say really tractable, I don't need to say really, they are tractable likelihood functions. But what's cool about that, in my opinion, is that this allows us to learn the sort of forgetting time lambda and the preferences beta 1 and beta 2 by fitting this model to network data. So because we have this nice likelihood function, we can do that. And when we apply this to something like the math PhD exchange network from the mathematics genealogy project, which is nicely written up in a nice form by Dane Taylor and collaborators, what we can see are some of our model fits for these parameters. So I want to point out that all of the beta 1s, regardless of whether or not we use a degree centrality, page rank, or spring rank, are positive. And so this suggests that mathematicians like status. We like to hire others who are of high prestige. But beta 2 across all three of these ranking models is negative. That suggests that we dislike big status differences. So we want to hire somebody who comes from a really strong department, but not too strong. So that was interesting to see as revealed by the actual data. But another nice thing that we can do is actually compare likelihoods to see which one of these mechanisms best corresponds to the patterns that we see in hiring. So as it turns out, in the math PhD exchange network, just an out degree centrality, which is how many other faculty are there who have a degree from the producing institution, does the best job in reproducing the patterns that we see versus PageRank or SpringRank. One other thing that has been very interesting in this work is that thanks to Mari, Phil, and Nicole's mathematical chops, they actually wrote down a nice theorem that shows that above a critical value of beta 1, that preference for prestige, a hierarchy is going to endogenously emerge and then be stable. The way that they actually proved it was by showing that the homogeneous state where there is no hierarchy becomes unstable at a critical point in beta 1. And so they derived these critical points for the different ranking systems. If you're interested in the sort of emergence and stability theorems, or for analyses of parakeet pecking orders or fraternity social orders, that's all in this paper, which is on the archive. But what I think is interesting about this in terms of faculty hiring is that it suggests that if we have a preference for prestige that's sufficiently strong, a hierarchy that is stable will endogenously emerge, meaning that may be one way that explains the dynamics we actually see in real hiring. Another approach to faculty hiring is to think more along the lines of preferential attachment, but here we're thinking about preferential rewiring. So imagine that we consider a typical preferential attachment mechanism for a network where when we form new links, we do so based on attributes of the nodes. But here we're not thinking about a growing network, as in many of the work on bibliographic networks or World Wide Web networks. Instead, this is a retirement plus somebody being hired into that position is equivalent to sort of rewiring one of the edges in the network. So in the diagram over here on the right, you can see departments in the big circles and faculty in the little circles whose colors correspond to where they came from. So for example, this orange person who my mouse is over now came from the orange department. And so the network itself is sort of at the big circle level, but the individuals are moving around. So if we then have an open position down at the teal department, we need to decide from which other department this person will be hired. So the in degree of the teal department won't change, but the source of the edge may be orange, blue, gold, or it could be a self-hire coming from teal. So these PIJs tell us the probability that the hire comes from a particular department, and these preferences could depend on out degree, some notion of homophily, like how many people in my department already come from a particular institution, or prestige ranking. We're going to mix it with some uniform randomness as well. So this allows us to ask, outside of a likelihood framework, which mechanisms, if we mix them together, best reproduce some of the empirical features that we see in real faculty hiring networks. So one way that we're going to look at this is to think about a steepness and inequality plane. So earlier we were talking about production inequality, that Gini coefficient. We've also talked about the fraction of the edges that move down the hierarchy, rho. So you can think about kind of different points in this space as hierarchical inequality, where the yellow dot is. If you had a low fraction of downward flow, but very dominant production, that would be the sort of decentralized winner-take-all regime. And a hierarchical yet egalitarian system would be over here in the green. So what we see in a real faculty hiring network, like for instance, one of the history networks, is actually that we are in that sort of upper right space. And we can compare different kinds of mechanisms. So the top column are, the top column here is an out degree and rank based mechanism. The bottom row is a homophily based mechanism. The left column is if we have a random start to our system. So we fix the department sizes, but the sources of those faculty are random. Or we can start it based on the configuration model where we're fixing both the in and out degree. So what you can see here is that, first of all, as I increase randomness, all of these come down to the same point, so that down here at the bottom left, in all 4 plots is fully random hiring. But depending on where we start, random start versus the configuration model start, And depending on how much randomness we mix in, we are either able to reproduce some of these properties of real networks or not. So a random start with a homophily-based mechanism is really unable to reproduce what we see in the history networks. So this exploration continues. It's a lot more empirical, a lot more, does the mechanism reproduce some of the patterns that we see in practice? So just a quick summary there, the hierarchy kind of naturally emerges from iterated hiring decisions when we have that endogenous feedback. And these retire, hire, and rewire models can recreate some, although in our paper, we find not all aspects of real hiring data. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about this final research effort, which is to try and understand the unequal impact of parenthood in academia. One of the reasons for this is that everything that I've talked about so far is really looking at the system either in part one here, sort of a frozen state. We're looking at what's happening when we look at the data as a whole. In step two, we're thinking about mechanisms, but at no point are we thinking about questions like retention or questions like biases in hiring. Instead, all of this is driven by patterns like homophily or prestige. But if we actually think about the people in academia who are trying to actually have these careers that we're trying to model, parenthood becomes a big factor. There's an interesting history here, which is that for a long time in the literature across lots of different fields, people have noticed that men and women tend to produce different numbers of papers. And while this seems like a very reductionist way to look at careers, cumulative productivity is often used to establish funding decisions or tenure decisions. And at least for me here at CU, something that I basically have to fill out a report for every year. How many papers did you write? How many are currently under review, and so on. If we synchronize people from career data based on when they started their assistant professor position in CS, business, and history, what you can see is that after about a decade, there's a difference between how many papers men have written and how many papers women have written. So the gaps here are annotated. But one thing that you'll notice is that if you look at the total trends in the main plots versus the little inset plots, which are not parents, you'll see that the gaps shrink. So there have been a lot of explanations of what the overall gap may be driven by. It could be parenthood, it could be institutional factors, which fields people actually specialize in. We know that theorists, for example, tend to write more papers than experimentalists. It could also be due to biases in peer review. But here we're going to focus on parenthood in particular. Prior work on the impact of parenthood is actually really mixed. Some have found a negative effect of parenthood on productivity. Some have found actually a positive effect where having children seems to make people more productive, definitely more reproductive, but they actually find people academically more productive. And then others that just find no effect at all. So our question here was whether or not there are productivity differences between men and women with and without children. And if so, are they changing over time? And are there differences in the importance and usage of parental leave across gender? So our data here comes from survey responses of tenure track faculty in CS history and business across the US and Canada. So we had around 3,000 responses. And these were linked then to publications over time and the prestige of the current institution. The way that we approach this is something called a CITS, comparative interrupted time series, where you have non-parents as one line. You have parents as another line, but there's an interruption in that becomes an offset at, in this case, the birth of the child. So because in our survey, we learned about when people had their children, we were able to analyze parents and non-parents around this point. So it's easy to align parents at the birth of their first child. For non-parents, we wrote down a model to try to statistically predict sort of counterfactual childbirth. So statistically, when are you likely to become a parent, even if you didn't have a child? What that allows us to do is compare people, for instance, with children, so women on the left, men on the right, and those without. So those are the open circles. And then we can ask what the interruption was and estimate as a percentage what that shock was. So on the plots, you can see that when we compare women with and without children, we see a negative 17% impact in CS, 23%, 24% in business, and around 50% in history. Interestingly, I don't know why the annotation is not showing up on CS, but interestingly, the effects for men are varied, where it almost appears that in business, having a child actually increases your productivity, whereas in history, we see that it decreases it. This point about business, where having a child could increase productivity for men, but decrease productivity for women, actually aligns with some of the literature from economics, where people have found that because of gender-neutral parental leave policies, but the fact that women are biologically tied to more of the childcare, oftentimes women take parental leave in order to care for the child, but men in economics sometimes take parental leave and just write more papers. That's been documented in econ in particular, but it's interesting that we see some hint of that in business. So that maybe helps us understand this sort of alternative view that we started with, where we can actually see the difference between men and women being there if we look at all the data, but it really shrinks when we look at not parents, suggesting that a lot of the effect that we're seeing in the total data is just driven by those differences between parents and non-parents. One final point that I wanted to bring up about these trends is that they're actually changing over time. So if we look at pre-2000 in the insets and post-2000s for those same plots, what we see is that pre-2000, the difference was around 30 papers, post 10 papers. In business, 3 and actually -1 after 10 years in business. So women writing 1 more paper on average than men. And then in history, the gap is 4 and then reduces to 3. So the gaps are narrowing, perhaps still persist. Although, as you can see, things are a little bit noisy and vary depending on which field you look at.
If I may briefly ask, history is an outlier because that gap of 3 only appears at the very end. Do you have an explanation for why the production of papers for women sort of stagnates?
I have no idea. I have no idea. So this is a mixture of books and papers. I'm not sure why, but you're right. Yeah, this is very peculiar, right? Like, why would this happen after some amount of time after the child's birth?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. The final point here is to think a little bit about policy. So we also surveyed whether or not people had parental leave policies, whether or not they knew about them, whether or not they said that parental leave was important in their current position, and whether or not they used it. And what you can see here is that universities in CS, a lot of them have no parental leave. A lot of them also have greater than 10 weeks, and some in the middle have 0 to 10 weeks. See that men and women typically know what the policy is at similar rates, although only around 80% of people know what the policy is at their current institution. Yet women suggest that parental leave was actually an important factor far more often than men, and women use parental leave far more often than men, even when we control for policies that are only available to women. So this is for computer science, and the long and short of it is that these patterns persist and are similar, although not exactly the same, depending on which field we look at. So women prefer and use parental leave relative to men, and we think this is really a critical policy and an equity tool. When we see that these gaps have narrowed over time but still persist, and the fact that women really value parental leave relative to men, although everybody says to some extent that parental leave is important in their decisions, we really think that this is a nice lever for universities to be able to pull to try and actually improve the situation for the women who they hire. So in this last point, just a couple of key follow-ups. Parenthood impacts women more than men in academic careers. We see that when using these nice methods of causal inference, like comparative interrupted time series. We see that women both care about and use parental leave more than men. And we think that this is not only has implications for recruitment and retainment, but also implications for our models. So the models that we wrote down in step 2 here had no sense of recruiting, no sense of gender, and no sense of retaining. And so one interesting thing will be to see whether or not we can fold in policy changes into some of the mathematical models of faculty hiring to see if they would make a difference. So thanks a ton for the attention. I'll wrap up here, but just note that the Atlas of Faculty Hiring Networks is in preparation. That's driven by Hunter Wapman over here. The emergence of hierarchy modeling 1 was work with Mari, Nicole, and Phil. That's under review. Dynamics of Faculty Hiring Networks is driven by Un Lee. And then the unequal impact of parenthood was driven by Allison Morgan, and that's in press. So thanks for the 3 extra minutes here. Sorry to run over, but I'm happy to answer more questions if you have them.
That's no problem. I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a question? All right, then I'll just ask one very brief question, which is, from your perspective, well, actually, I think we're running out of time. Maybe the best thing is that we can do a one-on-one later.
Sure. Send me an email if you have other things that come to mind, or feedback as well. I'd be very curious to know what you think, which things were interesting, which were sort of dry. So thanks.
No problem. All right, thank you. And with that, I think we can end the talk. Peter, could you stop recording?